One of the many stereotypes out there about my generation is that we have no respect for our elders. Have you heard that one? Well, that's one of the many stereotypes that I hate about people my age. There are actually ways in which I can connect with that attitude. Now, stay with me. While I wouldn't say that previous generations have left our world worse off than it was, it is true that there are legacies left by my parents' generation and the generations before them that present pretty serious problems that my and future generations will have to deal with. The chief example of this, of course, is the reality of climate change, the negative effects of which are already playing out in our world. It's also true that mine is one of the first generations to have to deal with living and working in a world with 5 or more living generations of adults. Did you know there were that many? This is not always an easy reality in which to live for any of us. Nor is it a reality in which one can live without being constantly pulled in different directions by past, present, and future. In Edmund Burke's time, a typical lifespan was much shorter, and likely people were never dealing with more than a couple of generations of adults at any given time. So while Burke believed that society should reflect the past, consider the present, and meet the needs of future generations, he was not actually living in a time when past, present, and future were trying to exist in one space. When I think about the balance of past, present, and future in our lives, and in our congregation, and in our society at large, what comes to mind for me is less about the dead, the living, and those yet to be born, and more about the daily challenges of balancing the needs and desires of so many different living generations. As always, there are certainly pros and cons to our current state of affairs. On the one hand, I don't have to fret about whether or not Bob is rolling around in his grave, about some of the changes we have or haven't made in church, because he's here to tell me. And you would, right? On the other hand, there's a near constant tension between those who would prefer things to stay the same, or even just move a little more slowly, and those who think the pace of change is painfully slow. And the transition of power from one generation to the next is certainly much slower than it used to be. In my mind, the biggest pro and con of having 5 living generations is the fact that we really are faced daily with this task of balancing past, present, and future. On the one hand, it can be frustrating and exhausting for everyone involved. On the other hand, we have this opportunity for amazing cross-generational relationships and partnerships to form. We actually get to talk to people who are 2 to 3 generations younger than us or older than us, and try to understand one another's perspectives and ways of thinking about this world. 100 years ago, people didn't get to do that. I remember having a conversation a few years ago with my mom about how challenging it was sometimes for me to work with people who were mostly her age, because I didn't feel like I was taken seriously. Now, she happened to be in a position at that time where she was working with a lot of people around my age, and told me about her own struggle of working with these young folks who felt like they were so smart and quick, and she didn't always feel like she could keep up anymore. it made me rethink my own insecurity and wonder how much of the things that I found frustrating were perhaps triggered by people who were feeling just as insecure in a different way. That little conversation gave me so much more empathy for the ways in which all of us are affected differently by our interactions with those of different generations, and the ways in which we all might be feeling similar things without even realizing it. As a minister, the place that I have the most opportunity to encounter both those pros and cons of having so many living generations is in congregational life. It's also the place where I have the most opportunity to consider those who came before and those who are yet to be. As Bob told us, Burke wrote that society is but a contract between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. With respect to church life, I might rephrase that idea and say that a congregation is but a covenant between the dead, all of the generations of those who are living, and those yet to be born. That's a lot of people to take into consideration. This idea feels particularly relevant coming in the midst of wrapping up our stewardship campaign for this year. As we try to responsibly fund our church now and into the future, all of those generations come into play. We're lucky enough to have some money from past generations that helps us to fund a portion of our budget today. At the same time, we need financial support from every generation of current church members and friends to really be able to support our present needs. And as we're making choices about our money, we need to be mindful of how we are leaving our finances to future generations. What kind of legacy are we leaving to our children and our children's children and their children? That notion has spurred our stewardship team to start thinking about how we encourage legacy giving in addition to our yearly pledges. It really does take a covenant between the dead, all of those generations who are living and those yet to be born, to fund our congregation for this year and into the future in a way that is sustainable, responsible, and visionary. I think the same could be said for a lot of aspects of church life. If we think about those three things, sustainable, responsible, and visionary. Sustainable, responsible, visionary leadership in a congregation never looks like just one generation being in power and staying in power, especially when we've got 5 to choose from. Unlike Burke and his contemporaries, we have the advantage of actually being able to work with people of different generations rather than just having to imagine what they might have wanted or may want in the future. We actually get to have cross-generational conversations like the one I had with my mom, where we can learn from one another and grow together. We can ask our elders about what has been most important for them about being part of this church community. We can talk to our youth about their dreams for our future. And then we can commit to one another to do the tough balancing act of figuring out how to incorporate that all into a present community that works for all of us. As usual, the challenging part of all this is that C word that we always come back to in Unitarian Universalism. Do you know the one I mean? I heard covenant. Covenant? Burke used the term contract, but I replaced it with covenant in my version for a reason. While contracts usually try to satisfy all parties in some way and often involve some compromise, all of that is for a very utilitarian purpose, to get everyone to agree to that contract, right? Contracts are based on utility. Covenants, on the other hand, are based on values. When we make a covenant, we start with the assumption that we are all connected, and what affects some of us affects all of us. We start with the assumption that every person is important and has something vital to contribute. And we start with the premise that we are better together, that living in community is intrinsically superior to living alone. All of these values lead us to make covenants, agreements that allow for us to be in community in a way that honors these deeply held values. And it is the last of those values that I think really differentiates covenant from contract. The assumption that living in community is inherently better than living alone. While contracts tend to focus on self-interest, on making sure that all parties are happy, covenants focus first on community, on making sure that the needs of the community as a whole come first. For that reason, I think covenant is a more appropriate term to use than contract when it comes to talking about balancing past, present, and future. Because the reality is, I'm sorry to say, but it's true, that the balancing act of past, present, and future is one that's not always going to make everyone happy, especially now that we've got more generations living together and trying to create community together than we ever have before. It's a literal balancing act, not always deferring to how we have done things in the past, not always moving so quickly to adopt the newest fad, not always thinking about who is just sitting here today in our pews. This is where Burke and I would differ, I think. Burke believed that the contract between past, present, and future was all about maintaining a particular social order, that of 18th century Britain. You might not be surprised that I'm not about maintaining 18th century Britain social order. But he believed that this balance had already been perfected in many ways and now needed to be maintained. In my mind, that kind of contract privileges the present and past above the future. So there may be ways in which it feels sustainable and responsible, but it leaves out that visionary part. And it certainly doesn't feel like a covenant. One of my hopes for this congregation and for Unitarian Universalism as a whole is that we can embrace this balancing act that is living and worshiping in congregations that now include 5 or 6 generations. I hope that our covenants allow us to listen to one another, to develop empathy and care for those who might see the world with entirely different ways than you do, and to begin to understand one another better. When we're able to do this, it makes it easier to remember the things that make us less happy may be exactly the same things that make this place meaningful to someone else in the room. One of the great challenges of my job is trying to facilitate this balancing act. On the other hand, one of the great joys is that I also get to witness when it really works, when authentic cross-generational community succeeds. One of the places I saw this most recently was at the once-a-month group that I facilitate at the Huntington Retirement Community down in South Nashua. Our conversation this past month drifted to the topic of school shootings and gun violence, which has been very present in our minds this past month. The elders gathered in the room had been watching the news and seeing all that the youth in Florida have been doing to speak out about gun control, and they wondered, what can we do? It felt serendipitous that just that morning I had learned that there was going to be a March for Our Lives here in Nashua. And so I told them about the event and encouraged them to attend. By the end of our time together, they were getting themselves ready to organize the whole retirement community to head downtown on March 24th to support the youth organizing this event. This felt particularly poignant as we took a moment at the end of our time together to remember Jeanette Brooks, a longtime member of this congregation and an even longer time rabble-rouser for social justice, and committed ourselves to rabble-rousing in memory of her. All the generations were present in the room in that moment. Those who had come before and inspired us, those who were here now seeking to work together to make a difference, and those who are yet to come, the future children who we want to be able to feel safe when they go to school. Sometimes, the fact that we have a debt to our past, a duty to our present, and an obligation to our future can feel like a burden. Other times, it is in this balancing act that we find joy and beauty in our world. May we commit ourselves to this balancing act of past, present, and future, knowing as we do that we are better together, knowing that we need all of these generations, the ones here, the ones not here, to work together to build the world as we wish it to be. May it be so.
Circus crowd.